Everybody, as we say in South Africa, Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it, shalom, and goeiemiddag, all the languages in this part of the world. My name is Sihle Ngobese, or Big Daddy Liberty, from South Africa. That's the southern tip of Africa. I'm not alone, of course. I'm joined by my fellow brother in arms, in Liberty arms, Ibrahim. Hey, guy, welcome to this little chat.
Big Daddy, it's nice to finally join you.
Absolutely, man. It's good to meet you finally. And of course, in this age of lockdowns and government repression of freedoms, this is the new definition now of meeting someone. It's via these webinars and the like. Guy, we only have 30 minutes, so let's perhaps jump straight into the conversation as we really look at broadly, the making the case for liberty and really freedoms on the African continent. And, I must remind viewers, especially those who aren't that good at geography, that, where Ibrahim is where he's from, and, which is effectively in the west of Africa, and really where I'm from, which is in the southern tip of Africa, there are massive differences in each region and, from a cultural, language, and you name it perspective. But let me begin where I think I want us to begin, Ibrahim, which is to set the case, to set the narrative, if you will, for the viewer around the African experience of government and society post-liberation, the very sort of post-liberation, for lack of a better word, dispensations that we've seen on the continent. Maybe from where you are from, the west of Africa, Nigeria, and the surrounding countries. What does that look like in your part of the world? And, for the individual, have you been living in a free society?
Well, that's that's an interesting question to start with. Well, the experience in West Africa, right from the independence wave in 1960, has been pretty much the same across the continent of Africa. Where we had young African students in the diaspora, women leaders on the continent of Africa, particularly in West Africa, mounting challenges against colonialism, and tolerating ideologies. For example, you guys probably know that the faction led by Kwame Nkrumah, the so-called Casablanca faction, the African liberation nationalists and thinkers that see that they appreciate or lean towards more Marxist or socialist ideologies against the so-called Morovia leaders, nationalists who entertain pro-market ideas and individual rights and less government interference in the process of the economy, tolerated each other. And after that, we saw a rise in authoritarianism. For example, when majority of West African countries won independence in 1960, and after that, politicians, former nationalists, assumed power, and they controlled the legislative and executive branches of the government to the extent that they were the only ones, calling the shots. And of course, this is a great separation from what Africa, was used to during the nationalist struggles in the late 19th century until 1945 or 1947, depending on how you want to look at it. And this comprehension or solidification of power by fascist leaders since 1960 has come to a point where Africans, particularly young Africans, could not take it anymore. And we've seen this in the number of protests mounted against fascist governments or authoritarian regimes across Africa. So it's not only a West African narrative of moving from society where individuals appreciate ideological differences and respected diversity in government and checks and balances to a period between the independence wave until recently, where fascists, authoritarians have dominated political power, and young Africans now asking for better governance.
I want to jump in here because I think you've quite rightly set out the first loss, if I can call it that, of the African experience, which is the ideological loss, right? The idea that post-liberation movements across the continent, sadly, were inspired not by, Adam Smith or, Stuart Mills, but rather they're inspired by the likes of your Karl Marx and your Lenins. And the impact of that has been absolutely profound and severe for what was then the African individual. And really, I talk a lot about the individual because I'm a classical liberal, but really we're family societies, aren't we? And, insofar as the African case and our history, we've always organized our various societies, our various communities around families, or rather empowering families and the individuals in them, and a strong sense of community. However, those were disrupted, weren't they, historically, by this new crop, or then new crop of politician who saw the state as the way of organizing societies. Maybe talk to me about your example in your part of the world. How has the state been an impediment to the ability of the individual, families, to be the ones who pursue their opportunities, pursue their happiness, as the Americans call it in their constitution, to build the income, to build the wealth? Has the state in your part of the world been an enabler of freedoms, or a hindrance to the individual?
I'm actually glad you brought up that stark difference between what Africa was used to prior to the independence wave and what we have currently. First of all, original African society, and I use the word original with great intent, where societies where the individual was at the center of social construct. Of course, they were communal societies, right? But we've seen this, examples of historians decolonizing our history, and in that process, we now realize that our societies were societies that place huge premium on the liberty of the individual, and the power of the family, of the clan, not necessarily the king or the rulership. Of course, the king in some kingdoms were powerful. The Zulu king was powerful. The Yoruba kings and the other emperors in Ethiopia were powerful individuals. But still, the means of economic life of the country or the kingdom were vested in private enterprise, in community enterprises, in family, in clans. As a matter of fact, the biggest farms and plantations across the African continent were owned by clans and families. So that construct remarkably changed when, of course, our leaders, or students back then, went abroad and copied these ideas from Russia, from the Bolsheviks. The idea that the state has to be the central focus of any economic operation, of any reform. The individual cannot be trusted with the means of production. That families will eventually lead to corrupt gangs, or corrupt groups of monopoly minded individuals. And in that process, they recalibrated our economic consciousness. And of course, I'm so glad that since 2018, we've seen Africans standing up to demand for a change in that consciousness, from where we have government telling us what to do, government controlling the economic process, which of course has led to more poverty and unemployment in the continent, to young people now asking for the means of production to be vested in the individual, for young people to be allowed to invest in businesses, for government to be more transparent. And we've seen this in Nigeria. Many people will say the NSAS protest in Nigeria was triggered by police brutality, but these are problems triggered by deep lining issues like economic depravity, unemployment. For example, in Zimbabwe, the recent human rights protest was not necessarily about human rights, but majorly about the fact that 2/3 of the Zimbabwean population are unemployed. The inflation in the country is about 650%. We've seen the same protest, the same economic related protest in Uganda, where people are thinking Bobby Wine and the Red Beret individuals are protesting against Museveni. Of course, these are protests against Museveni, but they were not. They were triggered by economic depravity and hardship caused by repressive policies over the years, and compounded by COVID-19 lockdowns. So it's the same consciousness now emanating among young Africans, to calling for the abolishment of the so-called fascist establishments that has took roots ever since African countries got independence in 1960 and beyond.
No, I agree with you. And, maybe from the perspective of a South African, we have the exact same problems here, where, and I often frame it this way on my show. I speak a lot about the idea that the young African, what Professor Aite calls the cheetah generation, our generation, who stand opposed to the hippo generation, the sort of, the post-liberation politicians of various African nations. Our generation, yes, you're right. There is definitely an agitation towards a relinquishing of the grip, the vice grip that various African governments hold over their societies. My fear, and I want to put this to you, just get a sense of what you read in your part of the world. My fear, though, is that the battle of ideas, which is what I often refer to, is not necessarily being won amongst our generation to sway my generation towards a liberty-leaning side of the arguments. I think we might be seeing a replacement of one form of hard left ideology, which is yoked, of course, in the fascist tradition, to perhaps even a new generation of that. I mean, there are cases of that transition from a hippo generation of fascists and leftists to a new generation of fascists and leftists. South Africa, my country, being a prime example. Our post-liberation movement, the African National Congress, which is the political party that governs the country, are broadly a center-left to, quite firmly left movement that has seen the sort of policies implemented in this country that are, policies such as, broadly rather, policies that appropriate power and resources into the state, centralizes those, and follows redistributionist type policies. That's been the status quo in South Africa for the past 26 years of our democracy. And what you're seeing now, and this is what I want to put to you, is a young generation, yes, who are agitating for change, but who are also quite immersed in the language of the hard left in terms of ideas, policy, and ideology, and even fascist means of organizing their politics. We have a political party here, which is red in tooth and claw, called the Economic Freedom Fighters. How's that for delicious irony? But they don't fight for economic freedom because they are Marxist, Leninist in nature, and they're talking about, for instance, eroding property rights, growing the size of the state, and effectively, they bring that racial element, which is very sort of a new thing, isn't it? The sort of postmodernist critical race theory. They've definitely absorbed that from our American counterparts. And they're talking about, for instance, slitting the throat of whiteness here in this country, the third largest political party, believe it or not, saying outlandish things like that. But talk to me about maybe your part of the world. Are you seeing a young generation of liberty-minded people, maybe like you and I, who are prosecuting the battle of ideas and injecting those liberty ideas in your society?
See, Sheila, I would like to, make one point very clear. And
Yeah.
I understand the majority of our African audience will be young individuals. I want to reiterate that the biggest problem that we face as Africans in the pathway towards change is the problem of the embracing of leftist ideas, extreme leftist ideas by the younger generation. So the fire we're trying to quench, or the problem we're trying to kill, is the so-called fascist, the old Igbo generations. But it would be so dangerous to come to the table and be, propagating the same ideas that have put Africa in economic shambles for decades. I was talking to Professor Aite a few months ago about the chapter 9 of his book, Applied Economics for Africa, which is freely available on the African Liberty website, about its optimism. Ashagazi, the Cheetah generation, bringing about the so-called glory of Africa, whereas this Cheetah generation, as you've identified across the continent, are so much leaning towards the left. For example, I see no reason why after 26 years of the ANC, I mean, the ANC has been in power since 1994 in South Africa. The ANC controlled both houses of parliament, the national council of provinces and the National Assembly. In Nigeria, the APC, ruling party, controlled the executive. They control both houses of parliament, and these are the same setting across the continent of Africa. So I don't see a reason why a young African asking for his freedom, asking for a change of the status quo, will be leading its charge with the same ideas that have put Africa into economic misery for many decades. And I think it's much more even dangerous to see that the leading movements or bodies or individuals as regards this so-called change in South Africa, the EFF, in Nigeria, the Revolution Now movement, in Uganda, Bobby Wine's Power People movement, are left-leaning groups and individuals. It's so dangerous when we see that reality, and I think it's time for African liberation thinkers and young Africans probing for freedoms to start thinking about how to drive the narrative of embracing centrist, or I don't want to say classical liberal, but original ideas of freedom and enterprise and toleration that were embedded in our own cultural history, and promoting these ideas among ourselves, so that when eventually gets the chance to assume power and lead out individuals like Yoweri Museveni or Mnangagwa or Buhari, we're gonna lead our countries with ideologies that we can trust, that that are gonna bring us prosperity.
Yeah, and let me zoom in on this, because I think the viewer might be wondering, in a broad sense, what it might be like on the ground in a lot of these African countries. For the actual individual who lives in this part of the world, and specifically, let me zoom in on the idea of those of us who are on that liberty side of the argument. What is the reality for us here in terms of fighting and pushing back against the tyranny of the state and how it's been organized historically, which is mostly on the left and yoked in the tradition of Marxism and Leninism, and what it's been like at a societal level to try and inject these ideas, these freedom ideas into a society which assumes, therefore, given our history, that the state is the most effective way of organizing society. I want to put something to you, and it's a conversation I had with Magat Wade a while back when we were hosting this, and I think she's in the actual audience here. Yeah, shout out to you, Magat. And the point I made, or the question I posed to her is, there seems to be two distinct groupings of our generation. That is what Professor Aitie calls the Cheetah generation, the young generation, the agitating generation. You have the do-it-yourself young African, if you will, very strong, driven individual, family-orientated, entrepreneurial in nature. And depending on where they are on the African continent, because there's varying levels of state efficiency across, and I say efficiency in the negative, but just for the purposes of the conversation, I'll use that word. Varying levels of state existence on the African continent, a pervasive ideology that won't be expressed in traditional Western classical liberal words, right? When you have a chat with this young individual who's the entrepreneur, they won't talk to you about John Stuart Mills and all that, but they have an innate sense of the need for freedom, only insofar as their own quality of life and to be able to pursue an income and, of course, build savings and create wealth. That African individual, if you will, young African individual versus the other, who recognizes the type of society they live in, the type of status quo, which is very statist and government-centric, and therefore schmoozes with the echelons of power, the political elites that are often the richest people on this continent because of their proximity to the state which runs everything, and massive state industry, for example, that we have in South Africa. So that young person who sees politics and, of course, the state as a means of economic advancement and the like, talk to me in terms of your experience in your part of the world. Do you see that divide also in your part of the world, where there's these two distinct groups, and who's on the ascendancy? Who holds the levers of power in your part of the world? And is the state even that influential in your part of the world?
Right, Sheila. See, there is a great dichotomy among our generation, and particularly in the forum of liberty or freedom across the continent. There are some of us who have lived through hardships, in Cape Town, in Lagos, and Kenya, everywhere. And we've seen firsthand the results of living under conditions where your livelihood is determined by a few individuals in the government that have been in who have been in the government for God knows when. And there are some of us who grew up with privilege and we have, individuals that are in politics in our family, and we've really escaped that depravity for years. So you cannot bring both sets of individuals to the table and expect the same experience, narration of experience. So they're going to be starkly different, which is why I think many of us on this side of the spectrum needs to do more about driving conversation within our communities of, young individuals probing for liberty, questioning ourselves about what actually leads our motivation, what's leading our motivation, what's leading our charge, what is leading our policy recommendation. So if we are saying, okay, the primary problem in Nigeria is unemployment, right? And we are asking government to bring about, more jobs. So how do we want government to do it? We want government to create more factories, to expand ministries. And these are the calls during the NSAS protests in Nigeria, for instance, for government to expand ministries, create more government jobs. And it's so appalling to see that, we're making charge to bring about change, but at the same time, we're creating further problems because you are playing into the hands of these individuals the same way the EFF is playing into the hands of the ANC. When you see the EFF and Julius Malema calling for more nationalization of wealth. Okay, if you're not nationalizing wealth, who are the individuals that will be in control of those nationalized agencies? It's going to be the same ANC leadership, the same individuals that have been, affiliates of the ANC for many, many decades. And this is the same problem that resonates across the continent. So if we are asking for change, we have to be extremely conscious of the ideology within those charge. And as you said, Chile is so unfortunate that the Cheetah generation is within itself divided. And until we have those frank conversations about what is actually leading us and what we truly want, and the negative, against the positives, we really wouldn't bring about change. And in the end, we will still be playing into the hands of individuals like individuals in the ANC, in the APC, or individuals like John Magafuli and Yoweri Museveni across the continent. Because they really are watching our chart. They are seeing what we're doing. And they want to see the weakness. And the weakness right now is that ideological divide.
Mm. I'm just keeping an eye on time. I think we only have a few minutes left. And so perhaps let me pivot the conversation on what do we do then, right? So how do we win the battle of ideas, as I like to frame it, as liberty-oriented people, whether you are a classical liberal libertarian or even a conservative in nature, how do we win the battle of ideas? Now, to that, I can't be prescriptive. Africa is 54 countries. But I would offer the following in terms of what I'm doing here in South Africa. And I want to get your sense on this too, in terms of your work, Ibrahim. Here in South Africa, there is a deep, sorely needed, sorry, trap my own sentence construction there. Let me rephrase. Here in South Africa, there is a desperately needed drive for young African minds, young liberty-oriented minds, to start doing the hard groundwork to win the battle of ideas. And I talk a lot about the battle of ideas. It's an actual theory that I work off. It's the battle of ideas theory. It's the idea that it is he who injects the greatest volume of ideas into a society that is at the point of crisis who will win the day. He will sway that society in one given direction or the other. Now, in this country, we, as you mentioned rightly, we're fighting against a red in tooth and claw economic freedom fighters, EFF, who are fascist in nature. There's the ANC that we're fighting against, and we're importing via our universities the toxic ideologies of postmodernism and critical race theory from American universities. So there's a desperate need, therefore, for someone to be on the ground to do the work. Now, I've kind of volunteered myself. I've given up my what was very plush middle-class existence in Johannesburg, the sort of financial center of the country here, to literally live in my bakkie truck, I think Americans call it, my truck, to travel across the country, go to informal settlements, go to shanty towns, go into townships, what were created by apartheid regime, where most Black poor South Africans live, in order to prosecute the battle of ideas, to have that conversation around how do we build a prosperous, property-earning, liberty-leaning, and non-racial society. It's a tough fight, but someone has to do it in these communities. I've got a show, for instance, leveraging on technology, and I want to get your views on that, social media, to push these ideas out into a young African generation who are able to access this material now. I mean, most Africans now have a mobile device that can, stream content. So producing that content via the Big Daddy Liberty show, Big Daddy Liberty is part of the work. Again, this idea of pushing or rather prosecuting the battle of ideas, getting the ideas out into communities, and that's what I do from my side, right? So, and that's just in South Africa, but there are thousands upon thousands of other liberty-minded young Africans. You are one of them, Ibrahim. Talk to me about your work, pushing those ideas into your communities. What have you seen as being a key part of you prosecuting the battle of ideas on your side?
Right. I just want to point out, first of all, Sheila, that I'm just one among the many millions of young
Absolutely
fighting for these ideas. We're part of them, and there are much more, stronger heroes on the ground in Lagos now. I mean, the fellows that died in Lekki massacre, the individuals that were killed by the Cameroonian government, the Ethiopians, what about their own government? Well, they are superheroes, more heroes than myself or yourself, Sheila, frankly.
Absolutely.
But there are two things I really want to, advise my colleagues and the so-called Cheetah generation. The first thing will be for us not to shy away from the debate. There is a strong debate that we need to engage. And that debate borders around defending our own ideological slates, what we're bringing to the table. When you get to this protest or this forum of young individuals in Nigeria or South Africa or in Zimbabwe, you need to engage your colleagues on why you think your own ideas, why you think we should probe for changes, but changes through reforms that are much more classical liberal or freedom oriented or market oriented, as against to what the EFF or the Revolution Now movement or the Power People movement in Uganda are offering. So that's one. And again, if we do not do that, we're going to see, well, I mean, we've already seen it in Nigeria, for instance. The government's already proposing a social media ban. If we do not ask for the liberalization of the media space or the recognition of our freedom of expression, they will go ahead and initiate that legislation. In Zimbabwe, the government Mnangagwa banned protests. Imagine banned protests. I don't know what democracy the government will ban protests. If Zimbabweans and South Africans, frankly, do not argue against that, then we're going to see, a bloating of the authoritarian state. And the second advice will be for us to look inward. We do not necessarily have to go to America to look at Milton Friedman or Ayn Rand or whomever. These are these are amazing individuals, but the ideas of freedom, toleration, enterprise, human respect of human dignity are embedded in Africa's history. You don't need to go far. You just need to look, at your own cultural or ethnic history and see, cases of, individuals fighting against oppressive regimes, fighting against kings and monarchs. I mean, the Yoruba kingdoms were built by individuals, majority by individuals fleeing repression from certain kingdoms or government or kings, establishing smaller, kingdoms. I think it's the same thing resonates across the continent of Africa. So we really do not need to go far away to borrow ideas of these classical liberals, but there are Africa's own agents of change from the ancient Egyptian period, particularly during the Enlightenment period in Europe. We had Africans writing about ideas of limited government, separation of church and state, separation of religious institution and government. We need to look at these individuals and look at their writings and let those writings and ideas guide us in the 21st century.
That's right. And look, I would perhaps, as I keep it on time, I'll perhaps offer this as a possible way in which we can augment our efforts as individuals in the various corners of the continent that we're in, because often I also feel as though we don't even talk to each other, compare notes, support each other. And I'll say this to that rather. I think the time is ripe for the young African individual who has that innate sense of freedom, that burning sense that there is something more, something greater, which we can aspire to as the Cheetah generation. I think there's a value in me arguing that we need to leverage on technology, number one. As I mentioned, I host a weekly show called the Big Daddy Liberty Show, and a lot of what I do, is just literally picking up my phone if I'm in a part of the world, here, and just literally vlogging, right? And getting your voice out, short, punchy clips, which you can talk to issues which resonate to your fellow man in this part of the world, because you live there, right? So I would really want to see much more in other parts of the continent of young Africans doing exactly that, saying, hey, I'm in Nigeria, we're in this protest, we're pushing back against the state and really police repression in that part of the world. But there are broader issues, and you're able to see it as a fellow African and connect because they're actually online and doing that. I think for me, technology is going to be a game changer. And I say this as if, it's yet to come. It's already here. Technology is an absolute game changer in linking us up as young Africans. I think that beyond that, it's us also translating a lot of these concepts, which yes, are part of the Western liberal tradition, but into our local languages. Part of what I'm doing is translating a lot of Milton Friedman stuff, John Stuart Mill's, into short sound bites that I take with me into the poor neighborhoods that I work in here, in order to crack this stronghold that politicians have, over poor communities in particular, and to give people to empower other people to be able to make the arguments around why their freedom and their sense of self, the individual and families, are much more important than the state. I think if we can begin to do that, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Ibrahim, as we close, you can begin to see, us begin to push back against the tyranny, get back against the creeping hand of the state in various parts of Africa. And just as a last point on my side, the international community rendering support in a meaningful way, of augmenting the voices of young Africans without a filter, literally just hit the share button, like the content, follow the various shows. There are various podcasts now, and let me speak as a South African, that are rising up here, that are liberty orientated. The Big Daddy Liberty is just one of many. And I want to get your sense on that, Ibrahim, because again, it's about getting that voice out, isn't it?
Absolutely right. And I appreciate the fact that you actually underscore one point, that the freedom of expression through technological means, through social media, is perhaps the biggest weapon we have as young Africans. And I have a video in the cuts, which was an interview with George Aite, and I asked him, Prof, so what do you think is the biggest challenge to prosperity in the 21st century in Africa? And he said, you don't believe Chile. He said, it is the freedom of expression. Once young Africans can promote and defend their right to express themselves through means of technology, through social media, through whatever other means, once we can uphold those rights, then every other pillar of oppression in the states will crumble. And I want to encourage my younger colleagues across the continent to keep fighting for these ideas. Do whatever you can to keep promoting these ideas. And with one discussion at a time, we will bring about the prosperity of Africa in the 21st century.
Absolutely, Ibrahim. Just finally, how do the people reach you? I think we have run out of time, but how do the people reach you on your social media? And if you are a writer, where do we find your work?
Actually, yeah, I do have a book coming up next year. It's about ideas of freedom, tracing the ideas of freedom in Africa, from the ancient Egyptians to the Ethiopians in the 16th century, and to West Africans, South Africans. And it should be released by sometime next year. And I also recently did a paper with Oxford University Press about religious freedom movement in ancient Ethiopia, and that should be coming out in the next month. And of course, I'm on social media at Ibrahim Anoba, but I want to encourage everybody to follow our works at africanliberty.org. It's a platform for young Africans for expressing their views, their policy opinions, and we work with young Africans across the continent to help them get published in major media outlets. And you're going to find articles on our website, africanliberty.org, very, very remarkable and relevant to your liberty mind.
That sounds absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. And if you're interested, of course, in what happens here in the southern tip of Africa, you can follow me, Big Daddy Liberty, on all your social media platforms. That's Big Daddy Liberty. And of course, you can watch the Big Daddy Liberty show every Wednesday on YouTube and on Facebook as I bring you what it is and what it means really to fight for life, or the ideas rather of life, liberty, and property rights in the streets of South Africa and Southern Africa. You can do that, of course, and you can also support my work. You can find all my details on my social media. Let me say thank you very much to the organizers of this wonderful webinar and stream. Thank you for watching. And Ibrahim, thank you, brother. It's very good to meet you. And I think I'm going to hand over to Michael to end the stream. Thank you so much for watching.
My pleasure.